The temperature dropped 19 degrees below zero on the morning Nora Voss walked away from everything she had ever known. She did not look back. The wind came off the Missouri River bottomlands like something alive and angry, cutting through her wool coat as if the fabric were paper, finding the gaps at her wrists and collar, and pushing cold air against her skin with the indifferent persistence of a thing that does not know it is cruel. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, a change of clothes, her mother's Swedish Bible, and a small tin box that held $287 in paper bills and silver coins wrapped in wool felt so they would not clink. That was the whole of it. That was everything she had in the world on the 23rd day of November, 1876. Behind her, the homestead where she had spent the last 4 years of her life sat low and square against the Dakota sky. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin white line. Light glowed warm and yellow in the window. Clem Stanton, her stepfather, was already back inside warming himself by the stove he had not built and eating from a table he had not earned. He had made his position clear that morning with the particular efficiency of a man who has rehearsed his cruelty and no longer feels the need to apologize for it. Nora was 16 years old. She had been given a choice, which is to say she had been given no choice at all. There was a widower in Sioux Falls, a man named Garrett, who was 47 years old and had already buried one wife and needed someone to cook his meals and raise his 3 surviving children and keep his house and ask nothing in return beyond the security of a roof and whatever warmth a practical arrangement could provide. Clem had found him. His new wife, a woman named Dorothea, who had arrived from Fargo exactly 6 weeks after Nora's mother died, had suggested it. Together they had decided that this was a reasonable solution to the problem of a 16-year-old girl who had no legal claim on anything and no one willing to fight for her. Marry Garrett or leave. Nora left. She had not cried. She had not argued. She had looked at Clem Stanton for a long moment, long enough that he shifted his weight and looked away from her, which told her everything she needed to know about where the power actually sat in that room. And then she had picked up her bag and walked out the door into the freezing morning air and started moving south along the river road without looking back. She had been planning this for 6 months, not the walking away part. She had not wanted to walk away. She had wanted to stay on the land her mother had worked in, the house her mother had helped build from raw Dakota ground, tending the garden her mother had planted with seeds carried all the way from Minnesota in a cloth sack tucked inside her travel trunk. She had wanted to stay in the place where her mother had been most fully herself. That was what she had wanted. But Ingrid Voss had been dead since March, taken by cholera in 11 days. And what Nora wanted had stopped mattering to anyone the moment they lowered her mother into the frozen ground and patted the earth smooth over her. Ingrid Voss had come to Dakota Territory from central Sweden when she was 22 years old, crossing the Atlantic alone, with a trunk of clothes, a box of seeds, a Swedish Bible with her grandmother's handwriting in the margins, and a mind that worked with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned early that the world does not arrange itself to accommodate you. You accommodate yourself to the world, and then you find the places where the world can be shaped, and you shape them without making a production of it. She had married Nora's father, a man named August Voss, who was good and steady and dead of a lung fever before Nora turned 8. Then she had worked the homestead alone for 4 years, not struggling, but managing the way competent people manage, which looks effortless from the outside and costs everything on the inside, before Clem Stanton appeared charming and capable seeming, with strong hands and a pleasant enough manner, and she had made the practical decision to marry him. Because 2 people can do what one cannot in Dakota, and the winters are long, and the work does not stop because you are grieving and exhausted and alone. She had not loved Clem Stanton. Nora understood that now, looking back with the clarity that distance provides. Her mother had assessed him the way she assessed everything, carefully, practically, without sentimentality, and had concluded that he was useful and not dangerous. She had been right about useful. She had been wrong about not dangerous. But Ingrid Voss had known she was sick before anyone else did. She had felt something changing in her body in the winter of 1875. Something she could not name but recognize the way you recognize a coming storm before the clouds arrive. A change in pressure, a quality of stillness that means something is gathering. And she had spent the months between that recognition and her death in March of 1876, doing what she had always done, preparing. Nora did not know any of this yet. She knew only that she was walking south in 19 below cold with her mother's Bible pressed against her side and the weight of the tin box in her bag and no clear destination beyond the general direction of a way. The river road was a track in the frozen grass barely distinguishable from the surrounding prairie, and the sky above it was the flat white of a sky that has decided nothing interesting is going to happen today. She passed Birger Halverson's homestead at the north edge of the bottomlands. She still thought of the neighbors by the names her mother had used the names from before Clem, and then the Brower place with its solid stone walls, sweating frost on the exterior, and then the long empty stretch where the river bent west and the land opened up into something that felt less like country and more like a statement about how small a person could be. By midday, she had reached an abandoned grain storage building 3 miles south of the Stanton homestead. It had belonged to a farming operation that had failed 2 years prior, the owner gone back east. Without explanation, the structure left standing because it was not worth the cost of tearing it down. The roof was intact, the walls blocked the wind. There was a rusted iron latch on the door that she could pull closed from inside. It was not warm, but it was survivable. She went inside. She sat down on the cold floor with her back against the south-facing wall and her canvas bag in her lap, and she breathed slowly and deliberately until her hands stopped shaking from the cold and the adrenaline both. The sound of the wind outside was considerable. Inside, it was just a sound. Then she opened her mother's Bible. She had carried this book for 6 months without opening it. It had been Ingrid's, and Ingrid had read from it most evenings before bed. And after Ingrid died, Nora had taken it from the bedside table. Not because she was particularly religious, but because it was the object that most completely felt like her mother. The worn leather cover, shaped by years of handling the pages soft and slightly wavy at the edges. The faint smell of the beeswax Ingrid had used on her hands every winter to keep them from cracking in the dry Dakota cold. The smell of her mother's hands. Nora had not been able to open the book because opening it had seemed too much like beginning the process of turning her mother into a memory, and she had not been ready for that. She had never looked inside the back cover. The bills were folded there precise and flat, the way Ingrid folded everything with the corners aligned and the creases sharp as if disorder in small things was a concession she refused to make. $200 in paper currency. $87 in silver coins wrapped in a piece of fine wool felt, which explained why the book had always seemed slightly heavier than it should. And tucked behind the bills, a piece of paper folded into quarters, the folds worn soft from being opened and refolded many times, which meant her mother had read it more than once, which meant she had returned to it. Nora unfolded it carefully as if the paper might tear through it was good stock and showed no sign of fragility. Her mother had written in Swedish on one side and English on the other. The handwriting was small and deliberate and very even. The handwriting of a woman who has learned to write in conditions that do not encourage sloppiness. Cold rooms, poor light paper that costs something. Nora sat in the cold of the abandoned grain house and read both sides, twice her breath misting in the frigid air. The Swedish side was technical. It described in careful, sequential detail the construction method her mother's father had used in Dalarna, the province in central Sweden, where Ingrid had grown up, where the winters were long and the timber was expensive, and the people had learned generations ago that the earth itself was a resource that cost nothing but labor, the depth of excavation, the thickness of sod walls, and the critical measurement of the air gap between them. The angle of the roof for snow load and drainage, the placement of the chimney and the angle of the flue for natural draft, the floor grade for water drainage, measurements precise enough to build from. Ingrid had transcribed them from memory, and the memory was perfect. The English side was 7 sentences. Nora read them once quickly, and then sat very still for a moment, and then read them again slowly. I know Clem will send you away. He is not a cruel man by nature, but he is a weak one, and Dorothea will push him further than he would go on his own. I have watched this coming since last winter, and I have prepared what I can. The money is from the egg sales saved separately for 3 years and kept from the household accounts. The instructions on the other side are from your grandfather who built into the earth in Dalarna and never once lost a winter's worth of food or warmth. You are smarter than anyone in this territory knows, including yourself. You are not being abandoned. You are being sent forward. Nora read the last two sentences again. You are not being abandoned. You are being sent forward. Her mother had known before the cholera had suspected, before the cholera had spent months preparing for a future she was not going to live to see. Quietly saving money from egg sales and keeping it out of the household accounts where Clem might notice it. Carefully transcribing her own father's knowledge onto a piece of good paper. Folding it precisely and placing it inside the back cover of the Bible with the coins wrapped so they would not betray themselves. And then replacing the Bible on the bedside table and going about her days as if she had not just arranged for her daughter's survival without her. Ingrid Voss had looked at the situation, assessed it with the clear-eyed practicality that had defined her entire life, and made a plan. Nora pressed the paper against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes. She cried. She had not cried at the funeral, had stood at the graveside in the March cold, with her face composed and her hands folded, and her grief locked somewhere below the level of expression, because there had been too much to manage, and grief takes energy she had not had to spare. She had not cried in the 6 months since, but she cried now alone in the cold grain house, with the wind pushing against the walls and the smell of frozen earth and old wood around her. And she let herself cry without restraint, until there was nothing left to cry, until she was empty in the way that follows complete feeling. Then she wiped her face on her coat sleeve and sat up straight. She read the technical side again. Then she read it twice more, working through each measurement in each detail and the reasoning behind each step, committing it to memory, the way her mother had taught her to memorize important things. Not just the what, but the why, because the why is what allows you to adapt when circumstances do not match the instructions exactly. By the time the light began to fail outside, she had the outline of a plan. Not just a plan for the night, a plan for the winter. She spent that night in the grain house, cold but alive, sleeping in her coat with her bag under her head, waking every 2 hours to move her fingers and toes and confirm that nothing had gone numb. In the morning, she ate the last of the bread she had brought and drank a handful of snow melted in her cupped hands and started walking again. Not away from something this time, towards something specific, the land office in Yankton. It took her 2 days to reach it. On the first night, she found shelter in the barn of a family named Ostergaard, who asked no questions when she knocked on their door near dark and asked if she might sleep in the barn. They gave her bread and a wool blanket without being asked, and in the morning the wife had left a small parcel of dried meat by the barn door. Nora left 2 silver coins on the door ledge in exchange, which was more than it cost and which was the point. She arrived at the Yankton land office on the morning of the 25th of November and filed for a homestead claim under the name in Voss. The clerk was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the distracted manner of someone who has processed enough of these transactions that they have ceased to be events. He wrote down her information without looking up from his ledger. She gave her age as 18. He did not ask for proof, which she had counted on, because she had watched enough adults process information about children to know that they tend to fill in blanks with what they expect, rather than what is actually in front of them. And a girl walking into a land office with $200 and a composed expression reads as older than she is. She had 160 acres. She chose them with the care her mother would have recognized. 3 hours at the survey map, studying the terrain, reading the land. The way the technical side of the letter had taught her to read it, not for what it looked like on the surface, but for what it offered underneath. Most of the unclaimed land in the area sat on flat ground exposed to the open prairie in every direction, which meant exposed to every wind that came down from Canada between October and April. The experienced settlers had built on flat ground because flat ground was easier to plow, and because the construction they knew, timber frame houses built upright and square against the sky, worked the same way regardless of terrain. But Nora was not planning to build a timber frame house. She chose a quarter section with a south-facing hillside along the western edge of the bottomlands. The land was considered poor by the other settlers because the hillside made plowing difficult, and the flat sections were mostly river clay that drained badly. Two previous claimants had looked at this parcel and passed on it without much deliberation. Nora looked at the south-facing slope and saw what her grandfather had seen in Dalarna, a hillside that would work with her instead of against her, earth that would shelter rather than expose, thermal mass that would cost nothing because it was already there waiting for someone to be smart enough to use it. She paid the filing fee and walked out into the November cold with a piece of paper that said she owned 160 acres of Dakota territory, which made her at that moment considerably more land-rich than Clem Stanton had intended her to be. She had stopped counting Clem Stanton. The Zimmerman family farmed a claim 4 miles north of Nora's new land, and they were known in the settlement for two things. They had more sons than they had acreage, and the middle two boys would take work where they could find it. Carl was 15 and Otto was 14, and their father was a German farmer who had come from Hamburg with 6 sons and a philosophical acceptance of the fact that Dakota territory was not going to make room for all of them equally. Nora walked to their farm on the afternoon of the 26th and made her offer, 50 cents a day each. She explained what she was building standing in their yard with her canvas bag over one shoulder and the cold settling in around them. And Carl looked at her with the evaluating expression of a boy who has been doing men's work long enough to know the difference between a plan and wishful thinking. "What are we building?" he said. "A house," Nora said. "Where?" "In the hill." Carl looked at Otto. Something passed between them, not quite amusement and not quite skepticism, but some blend of both that teenage boys produce when confronted with an idea that seems improbable but comes attached to actual money. 50 cents, Nora said again. They started the following Monday. The first person to come and tell her she was doing it wrong was Birger Halverson. Birger was 42 years old and had been in Dakota territory for 4 years and had spent most of those 4 years building and losing houses to the various disasters the prairie offered, which had given him strong opinions about construction and an equally strong conviction that his opinions were correct. He had lost his first house to a grass fire that started from a spark off the stovepipe on a dry August afternoon and consumed everything in 11 minutes. He had lost his second house to a snow load in February that collapsed the roof at 3 in the morning while the family slept, and had spent 2 nights in the Brower barn while he patched what was salvageable and decided what to do next. He was on his third house now, a solid timber frame structure that had cost him $400 in lumber freighted up from Sioux City and another $100 in labor from a carpenter brought out from Yankton, and he was genuinely proud of it. It burned through firewood at a rate that made him anxious every fall when he calculated his winter supply against the money available to replenish it, but it was standing and it was his and he believed in it. He rode over on the second day of construction when the excavation into the hillside had reached 4 feet down and 8 feet back, and the shape of the project was becoming apparent to anyone who looked at it. He sat on his horse at the edge of Nora's claim and looked at the hole in the ground for a while, and then looked at the girl standing beside it with a shovel. "You're building into the hill," he said. His English carried a Norwegian cadence that lifted his declarative statements into something that sounded like questions, though they were not. "Yes," Nora said. "The weight of the earth above will collapse your roof. I'll use support timbers. Lodgepole pine 8 inches in diameter. Timbers cost money. You have money for that kind of timber. I've budgeted for it." Birger pulled off his hat and scratched the back of his head with the deliberate gesture of a man working through a problem. "You understand cold air sinks," he said. "You will be at the bottom of a hole collecting all the cold from the surrounding land. You'll freeze before February. The earth at depth holds a stable temperature," Nora said. "It doesn't change the way surface air does." Birger laughed not unkindly. He had the laugh of a man who has seen enough failure on the frontier to feel genuine sympathy for people who are about to experience it. "The earth is cold, girl. This is Dakota. Everything here is cold. You need thick walls and a good stove and plenty of seasoned wood. You need what every family out here needs." He rode away. She watched him go until he crested the low rise to the north and disappeared, and then she went back to work. Aldrich Brower arrived the following afternoon. He was a German mason by trade who had spent 8 months constructing his family's house from mortared stone quarried from the riverbank, a structure he considered the finest dwelling in 20 miles, and which had in fact survived everything the previous 2 winters had offered. The project had cost him $370 in the better part of a year, and he had strong opinions about construction that were grounded in genuine expertise and therefore harder to dismiss than Berger's. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into the focused concern of a professional assessing a problem. Moisture, he said. His English was precise and clipped-accented but clear. Underground, everything becomes damp. The water comes through the earth regardless of what you do to stop it. Your clothes will rot, your food will spoil, your lungs will fill with mold. My cousin in Pennsylvania attempted something similar. His wife was dead of consumption within 2 years. I'll ventilate the space and grade the floor for drainage, Nora said. Grade the floor. Brower almost smiled, which on his face was a slight tightening around the eyes. With what expertise you are. What 15, 16, 16, Nora said. 1 inch drop per 6 feet of run, from the back wall to the entrance. Brower was quiet for a moment that was different from his previous silence, denser, more attentive. That is the correct specification, he said finally. Where did you learn that my grandfather was a builder? He looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize over the following weeks. The expression of a man who has committed to a conclusion but finds himself encountering evidence that complicates it. He left without further comment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Reverend Silas Crow came on the 4th day of construction. Reverend Crow had come west to bring civilization to the frontier, which in practice meant he held church services in his parlor every Sunday morning, offered his opinions on matters of propriety to anyone who would listen and several who would not, and had built himself a white-painted clapboard house that looked as if it had been lifted directly from a village green in Massachusetts and set down on the Dakota prairie without anyone explaining to it that it was now in a different climate. The wind hit it as if personally offended by the presumption. He spent a significant portion of his income on firewood. He stood at the edge of Nora's claim with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict that he has already decided. Miss Voss, he said, I understand your circumstances are genuinely difficult. But this, he gestured at the excavation at Carl and Otto working in it, at the sod brick stack nearby. This is not appropriate. This is not how decent people live. A proper home has walls and windows and a door that faces the road and announces to the world that civilized people reside within. What you are proposing announces nothing but desperation. I filed a homestead claim, Nora said. It's legal. The law may permit it. Nature will not. You will be gone before spring and this hillside will go to someone more suited to make use of it. He left. Nora picked up her shovel and went back to work. What she had not told any of them, what she had no clear language yet to articulate, was that she had not arrived at this plan through stubbornness or through some sentimental attachment to her grandfather's methods, or through desperation that had nowhere else to go. She had arrived at it through 4 years of careful, systematic observation. She had watched Berger's first house burn because it was dry timber, and one wind-blown ember from the stovepipe was sufficient. She had watched Aldrich's beautiful stone house develop condensation on every interior surface in winter, because cold, dense stone and warm, humid indoor air produce moisture as reliably as any chemical reaction, and she had watched Aldrich's children cough through February. She had watched Reverend Crow add boards to his north-facing wall every October, and watched his firewood stack shrink visibly each week through December. She had watched what worked as carefully as she had watched what failed. During the summers, she had spent time talking with the native traders who still moved through the area. Careful conversations, patient on both sides, that had given her pieces of information she had stored without quite knowing why. They had described how their people had wintered in earth lodges before the treaties pushed everything west. Warm in winter, cool in summer. Built from materials that cost nothing but labor and knowledge. She had talked with an old French trapper who passed through in August, a man of 70 or so who had spent 20 years living in a dugout on the James River and was so thoroughly healthy that the fact of his age seemed almost impolite. He had talked to her for 2 hours about moisture management and floor drainage and the importance of getting the ventilation gap positioned correctly relative to the prevailing seasonal winds, speaking with the easy precision of a man describing something he has understood for decades. And she had her grandfather's instructions written in her mother's careful hand. What she was building was not an experiment. It was a synthesis, the combination of knowledge from three separate traditions, Swedish, French, and the older knowledge of the people who had been on this land longest, all arriving at the same fundamental answer about how to survive a northern winter without fighting the earth. The earth was not the enemy. It never had been. The people who had treated it as an enemy were the ones burning through their firewood and sleeping in their coats and losing their children to cold in February. Construction took 19 days. The excavation went 8 feet back into the hillside, then 3 feet down from the natural ground level, 12 feet wide, and 16 feet deep, with 9 feet of headroom at the front face where the entrance would be. The floor sloped 1 inch per 6 feet toward the entrance, Aldrich Brower's specification, which she had known before he stated it, and which she did not mention to him when he came back on the third day and stood at the edge of the excavation, checking her work with the involuntary thoroughness of a craftsman who cannot help but evaluate what he sees. He said nothing. He left. She took his silence for what it was. The excavated earth became building material, which was one of the principles her grandfather's instructions had emphasized. Dakota sod was ideal for this purpose. Decades of blue stem and buffalo grass had woven their root systems through it until it had a structural integrity that loose soil does not. They cut 247 bricks, each 36 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. Each brick weighed approximately 45 pounds. Carl and Otto's arms grew stronger over the 19 days in ways they complained about and were secretly proud of, and Nora's back developed a new kind of ache that she thought of as her body's record of the work being done. The front wall went up 28 inches thick at the base, tapering to 20 inches at the top, thick enough to provide genuine thermal mass, heavy enough that no wind was going to move it. But the thickness of the wall was not the most important feature. 2 feet behind the exterior sod wall, she built an interior sod wall 12 inches thick with a 2-foot gap of still air between them. This was the element that her grandfather's instructions had emphasized above all others, the element that her mother had underlined twice on the Swedish side of the paper. Still air is a terrible conductor of heat. Those 2 feet of trapped, motionless air between the walls were worth more in thermal terms than 4 feet of solid packed earth, because solid earth conducts however slowly and still air does not. The roof required 6 lodgepole pine timbers, 8 inches in diameter, spaced 30 inches apart. She paid $90 to have them freighted from the Black Hills, which was nearly half her entire materials budget, and she did not hesitate over the decision. The roof was the one structural element she could not improvise around. A roof failure would not be an inconvenience. It would be a death. The timbers went up on a clear afternoon in mid-November, Carl and Otto working with her to position them, and when the last one settled into place and the structure held, all three of them stood looking at it for a moment without speaking. Willow branches across the timbers woven tight. $8 of canvas from the general store in Yankton. 2 layers of sod brick 14 inches, total 3 tons of earth that the lodgepole timbers accepted without complaint. The roof angled 2 inches per foot from back to front so that meltwater in spring would drain away from the structure rather than pooling and finding paths through the sod. The back 3/4 of the structure sat under 4 feet of hillside, invisible from above, contributing thermal mass she had not needed to purchase or transport. The chimney was a cast iron stove in the back corner, $23, with a pipe that angled into the hillside at 30 degrees and ran 9 feet through a clay-lined tunnel before emerging 12 feet above the roofline. The angle created natural draft. The clay lining absorbed heat from the flue gases and transferred it into the surrounding earth, which transferred it slowly and continuously back into the living space over the hours after the fire burned down. Nothing wasted. Every calorie of heat doing double duty. Two windows salvaged from a demolished claim shack at the river, $12 the pair. Set deep in the sod walls, the 2-foot thickness of the exterior wall created natural light wells, recesses that gathered morning sun from the south and held it, directing it into the interior in a way that a flush-mounted window cannot. The door was 4-inch cottonwood planks on heavy leather hinges opening inward. A door that opens outward can be sealed shut by a heavy drift. She had thought of that. The floor was packed earth mixed with water and wood ash, tamped hard with a wooden mallet over 3 days, and then swept with fine sand. It had cost nothing and would last indefinitely. Earth floors are not primitive. They are practical. They are thermally connected to the mass below them, which means they hold heat the same way the walls do. Total materials cost $27. She had spent $130 in total, including the roof timbers, the windows, the stove, the canvas, the salvaged lumber for the door and furniture. She had $157 remaining. She moved her belongings in on the 3rd of December, on a morning that had gone completely still and brittle, the kind of cold that feels like the air itself has hardened into something you could strike and hear ring. Carl and Otto helped her carry the things she had stored at the Zimmerman farm, her rope bed frame and straw mattress, the small trunk with her clothes, a box of provisions she had bought in Yankton, the 2 chairs and small table that Carl had helped her build from salvaged lumber on the evenings after they finished the day's work on the dugout. When everything was inside, Carl stood in the middle of the space and turned slowly, looking at the walls and the ceiling and the floor, and the stove in the corner with its pipe disappearing into the hillside. "It's warmer than outside," he said. There was a quality of genuine surprise in his voice, as if he had not quite believed it would work, despite having built it. "That's the point," Nora said. He and Otto left, and she was alone in the earth for the first time. She lit a small fire in the stove, 4 pounds of wood careful and controlled, and sat on her rope bed with her mother's Bible in her lap, and listened to the wind moving above her somewhere far above, through the prairie grass on top of the hillside. Down here it was a sound and nothing more. Not a presence, not a threat. Just weather happening to someone else somewhere else, while she sat in the steady warmth that the earth had already stored for her. She thought about her grandfather, a man she had never met, who had built this same kind of shelter in a different country, in a different century, because the principles were the same regardless of which country you were in and which century you were living through. Earth holds heat. Still air insulates. Thermal mass resists change. These were not inventions. They were observations about how the physical world actually works. And the people who had made those observations first and built their lives around them had been warmer and safer and better fed than the people who had ignored them. She felt in a way she could not have articulated fully less alone than she had felt at any point in the 6 months since her mother died. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. He arrived on foot, which was unusual. Most of the homesteaders in the area moved by horse or wagon, even short distances, because the distances between properties were genuinely long and the cold made walking unpleasant. A man on foot in December tended to be either very poor or very purposeful, and this man had the look of the latter. His name, she learned later, was Corwin Hale. He was 30 years old, a school teacher who had come from Wisconsin 3 years earlier and taken a homestead claim to supplement his teaching salary, and he had studied natural philosophy at a college in Madison, which meant he thought carefully about how things worked rather than simply accepting that they did. He had a lean and considered look about him, the look of a man who is more interested in questions than in the security of already knowing the answers. He walked around her dugout twice without speaking. He crouched down to examine the visible section of the floor through the open entrance. He studied the chimney outlet where it emerged from the hillside. He pressed his palm flat against the exterior sod wall and held it there for perhaps 20 seconds, his eyes unfocused, feeling for something. Then he straightened up and looked at her. "Interesting," he said. She waited. "You're using thermal mass," he said. "Do you know that term?" "No," Nora said. He settled into an explanation with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoys making difficult ideas clear. The Earth, he said, is a heat reservoir. Not a source, it doesn't generate heat the way a stove does, but a reservoir, something that absorbs heat and stores it and releases it slowly. Right now in December, 6 feet below the surface, the temperature of the Earth in this part of Dakota is probably around 52 degrees. In the hottest part of summer, it will be approximately the same. The Earth doesn't change temperature quickly because it has enormous mass, and changing the temperature of enormous mass requires enormous amounts of energy. Your dugout is surrounded by a thermal battery that holds at roughly 52 degrees year-round. You add a modest amount of heat in winter, and you reach comfortable temperatures. You add nothing in summer, and you stay cool. Meanwhile, the rest of us are building wooden boxes that shed heat in every direction as fast as we can generate it, and we're working ourselves to exhaustion trying to replace it. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it, something more like recognition, the look of a person encountering an argument they had not expected to find here. "Did someone teach you this?" he asked. "No," Nora said. "I reasoned that if root vegetables stay at the same temperature all winter in a root cellar, I probably could too." Corwin Hale almost smiled, which on his face was a slight softening around the eyes. "There's a German physicist named Hermann von Helmholtz who has been writing extensively about energy conservation and thermodynamics," he said. "You've built a practical demonstration of his central theories, and you did it without knowing his name or reading a word he wrote." "Will it keep me alive?" Nora said. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "If you manage moisture and ventilation correctly," he said, "yes. It should work exactly as you've designed it." He paused. "There are genuine risks. If your chimney blocks carbon monoxide will kill you before morning, and you won't wake to notice it. If your drainage fails in the spring thaw, you'll be living in standing water. If those roof timbers carry more load than they're rated for a wet, heavy snow in March, you could have a collapse. And if you become ill, you are 3 miles from help across open ground." "I'll be careful," Nora said. "Being careful is necessary, but not sufficient," Corwin said. "Nature doesn't make exceptions for good intentions." He looked at her steadily. "I hope you make it. If nothing else, you'll prove something that deserves to be proven." He left without offering to help, which was the right call, and she did not want him to, which was a feeling she recognized as important and filed accordingly. That afternoon, Carl came back alone to retrieve his good chisel, which he had left wedged in the back wall of the excavation during the final day of work. He found it and was turning to leave when he stopped and looked at something in the corner of the excavation they had dug to check the drainage grate in the back section. He called her over. He had found it wedged into the earth of the undisturbed hillside 3 feet in from the edge of their excavation, a box made of tin plates soldered shut along every seam, the surface eaten through with rust in several places, but the structural seal still holding. It was roughly the size of a large book. It had been there for some time. Nora took it from him. It was heavier than she expected. She worked the rusted lid open carefully with her knife, and inside, wrapped in oilskin that had done its job over what appeared to be several decades, were 2 items: a piece of folded paper covered in small, careful handwriting in French, and a hand-drawn map on heavier stock. She could not read French, but she could read maps. The map showed the hillside, her hillside, in remarkable cartographic detail. The contour lines were accurately drawn. The prevailing wind directions in each season were indicated by arrows with written notations. The location of the thickest clay layer in the soil profile was marked with a crosshatch symbol. And there were 2 specific annotations that she understood immediately and completely, one showing the optimal angle and position for a chimney outlet to capture the natural draft created by the topography of this particular hillside, and one indicating the direction from which moisture-laden air arrived in spring and fall, which told her exactly where to position her ventilation gap so that moisture would flow through and out rather than pooling inside the walls. The chimney angle she had calculated herself. It was 3 degrees off from what the map showed. She adjusted it that same afternoon while Carl watched with an expression of someone revising their understanding of something. The ventilation gap she had positioned correctly by arriving at the same answer through a different route. She brought the document to Corwin Hale the following day and asked if he could read French. He could after a fashion enough to work through the text carefully with patience. The map and notes had been made, the document indicated by a man named Theodore Renaud, a French-born trapper who had lived in a structure on this exact hillside from 1842 to 1856, when he had died alone in a winter illness, with no family anywhere to claim his belongings or his knowledge. The notes were not sentimental. They were data. Temperatures recorded at consistent times of day across 14 winters. Wood consumption by month. Observations about which weather patterns cause the most heat loss and analysis of why. Notes on moisture management, on ventilation, on the behavior of the clay layer in the hillside through freeze-thaw cycles. 14 years of careful empirical observation, recorded with the precision of a man who understands that observation is only useful if it is accurate. The final entry in the document dated January of 1856. Corwin translated slowly, his finger tracing the words, "I have no children and no heirs, and I am not sorry for it. I have had 14 winters in this earth and been warm in all of them. I bury this for whoever comes next, because the hill is good, and the knowledge should not disappear with me. Whoever finds this is smart enough to use it." Nora held the paper for a long time after Corwin finished reading. Her grandfather in Dalarna building into hillsides because the Swedish winters were long and earth was free. Theodore Renaud on this specific hillside recording temperatures and refining his technique over 14 winters. The native traders describing earth lodges with the matter-of-fact clarity of people explaining something as obvious as breathing. Her mother, transcribing her father's knowledge onto a piece of good paper and hiding it in the back of a Bible with 3 years of carefully saved egg money. 3 traditions, 3 separate bodies of knowledge, all arriving at the same answer about the same fundamental problem. She was not the first person to understand this. She was not inventing anything. She was remembering. She placed Renaud's map on the shelf she had cut into the back wall beside her mother's Bible, and she went to sleep that night with the temperature holding at 51 degrees, and the wind doing whatever it wanted to do above her head, up there on the surface where the weather lived, while she lay warm in the earth below it. The first week inside the earth taught Nora things that no one had warned her about, and that she had not anticipated from her research. Not the cold she had prepared for the cold, which was the point. Not the solitude which she had decided somewhere between Clem Stanton's homestead and the Yankton land office to treat as a condition of her life now rather than a problem requiring a solution. What she had not prepared for was the quality of the darkness. The 2 salvaged windows set deep into the sod walls on the south face of the entrance gave her real light during the morning hours when the December sun hit the south-facing hillside at a low angle and sent amber light through the 18-inch light wells the wall thickness created. For those morning hours, roughly 7 until 11 on clear days, the interior held a quality of illumination that was genuinely beautiful, diffused and warm-toned in a way that direct daylight rarely manages. But by early afternoon, the sun had moved enough that the windows went gray, and by 3 o'clock in December, there was nothing coming through them that deserved to be called light. She kept an oil lamp burning for most of the remaining hours. She rationed the kerosene, carefully trimming the wick to its lowest useful setting, and arranged her tasks to match the available light, close work, and reading. In the mornings when natural light was sufficient, the coarser work of cooking and maintenance in the afternoons when the lamp's modest illumination was enough. The space smelled like earth. This was not unpleasant. It was the smell of her mother's root cellar, the smell of things being kept rather than consumed, of stability rather than exposure. She suspected that some people would have found it oppressive, that confinement and darkness would have worn on them. She found the opposite. The earth smell was a constant reminder of what surrounded her and what it was doing, absorbing heat, holding temperature, protecting her from conditions that were killing people in better appointed houses 3 miles away. The smell was evidence of a system working. Temperature management proved both simpler and more demanding than her theoretical understanding had suggested. Without any fire at all, the dugout held at 51 degrees survivable, but not comfortable for long periods of stillness. A small fire in the morning, 4 pounds of wood, brought the temperature to 63 degrees over roughly 2 hours. The thermal mass of the surrounding Earth then absorbed and held this heat, releasing it slowly back into the space over the following 8 to 10 hours. A second small fire in the evening, 2 pounds of wood, and the temperature when she woke in the morning was still 58 degrees. 6 pounds of wood per day, sometimes five. She had two cords stacked in the entrance tunnel kept dry by the roof above and the earth on three sides. At her consumption rate, she had enough wood for the entire winter past the spring thaw with surplus remaining. This was not an incidental fact. This was the central fact, the one that everything else followed from. The difference between 6 pounds a day and 40 pounds a day, compounded over 120 days of winter, was the difference between surviving and catastrophe. The moisture issue was real but completely manageable with the correct approach. She left the door cracked exactly 1 inch every day, regardless of outside temperature, even on mornings when the air coming through that gap was sharp enough to make her eyes water. The gap allowed the moisture generated by her breathing and cooking and the lamp combustion to exit before it could condense on the walls or ceiling. She checked the walls each morning by running her hand along them at waist height, and she found them dry every morning without exception. The floor drainage worked precisely as calculated. She tested it twice in the first week, pouring a quart of water in the back corner and watching it find the grade and move steadily toward the entrance, disappearing into the earth long before it reached her sleeping area. She slept well, better than she had slept anywhere since before her mother became sick. The neighbors came in waves. The first wave in the first 2 weeks had been the skeptics Berger Aldrich, Reverend Crow, arriving with their objections rehearsed and their confidence in those objections intact. The second wave was the women curious and cautious in roughly equal measure, bringing food or curiosity or both. Emma Sandvik came with her daughter Ruth, a girl of 8, who walked into the dugout and touched the wall immediately and said it was warm, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to perform surprise instead of feeling it. "The earth holds heat," Nora said. Emma ran her own hand along the interior wall. "I expected damp," she said. "The slope takes water away from the living space," Nora said, "and the ventilation gap keeps air moving through before moisture can accumulate." Emma looked at her for a moment with an expression that held several things at once, something like concern, something like assessment, something approaching respect. "You're alone here," she said. "A girl your age shouldn't be alone." "I'm all right," Nora said. Emma left preserved peaches and an open invitation in genuine warmth, and she did not believe Nora's assurance. That was all right. Nora did not need her to believe it. She needed it to be true, and it was. She was learning something in those early weeks that her grandfather's instructions had not covered, and Renault's notes had not addressed, and no one had thought to tell her. Solitude has a texture. The texture changes depending on whether the solitude is chosen or imposed. The solitude she had experienced in the 6 months after her mother died, surrounded by people who had decided she did not matter, isolated within a household that had closed itself around her absence, had been suffocating in a way she had not had the vocabulary to describe at the time. This solitude was its opposite. She had chosen it. She was managing it. She was learning from it. On most days, it felt less like loneliness and more like concentration. The 15th of December brought the first genuine test. A cold front moved down from Canada on a Tuesday morning, dropping the temperature from -6 to -18 in the space of 4 hours, which was fast enough that the air seemed to change texture between 1 hour and the next. It held at -18 for 3 days. Nora woke on the first morning to a dugout interior of 58 degrees the thermal mass had held through the night without any fire burning. She lit the stove, added 6 pounds of wood in 2 sessions through the morning, and watched the temperature climb to 64. It held there through the day, declining slowly to 60 by evening when a second small fire brought it back up. Outside, Birger Halverson's timber frame house was burning through a quart of wood every 4 days. His family was sleeping in their coats because the bedroom at the north end of the house, furthest from the stove, could not maintain a survivable temperature in -18 without the stove running so hard it consumed resources faster than he could replenish them. Aldrich Brower's stone house, for all the genuine quality of its construction, had interior walls that wept with condensation whenever the temperature differential between inside and outside exceeded a certain threshold, which -18 reliably exceeded, and his youngest daughter was coughing again. Reverend Crow's white-painted clapboard house had boards working loose on the north-facing wall from repeated freeze-thaw cycling, and wind was finding its way through the gaps. And his congregation sat in their coats during the Sunday service he held in his front parlor. On the third morning of the cold snap, Nora was outside at first light, splitting the day's kindling in her wool sweater without a coat. The air at -18 is sharp enough to make the eyes water and sting the nose on the inhale, but the work generated sufficient heat that she was comfortable. She heard Birger Halverson's horse coming before she saw him. He rode up and stopped and looked at her, at the sweater, at the splitting work, at the thin thread of pale smoke rising from the chimney outlet on the hillside above, with an expression that contained several adjusting calculations. "How much wood are you burning?" he said. It was a question that tried to sound like an observation. "6 pounds a day," Nora said. "Sometimes a little less." Birger said nothing. "Then I've burned that much this morning alone, before the sun was fully up." "You're heating air," Nora said. "Air holds heat poorly. It all escapes through the walls as fast as you put it in. The earth holds what the stove puts into it and releases it slowly. You're fighting the cold. I'm not fighting anything." Birger was quiet. He dismounted. He stood at the entrance to her dugout. "Can I see inside?" he said. She showed him. He stood in the center of the space and experienced what everyone experienced when they came in from the winter exterior, the warmth that was not the aggressive, concentrated heat of a stove, running hard but something distributed and even coming from the walls and the floor and the air together, without a hot zone near the stove and without a cold zone near the door. The temperature of the room was the temperature of the room, and it was the same temperature everywhere in it. He pressed his palm against the back wall the way Corwin had done and held it there. The earth was not cold. It was warm in the way that living things are warm, not generating heat, but holding it, releasing it at the rate the space needed. "God in heaven," Birger said quietly. "It works because the earth doesn't change temperature quickly," Nora said. "It's stored heat all fall. It's releasing that stored heat now. I just have to add enough with the stove to stay comfortable." Birger stood for a long time looking at the walls. Then he said quietly, "My father in Norway built into hillsides. When I was a boy, I visited him in winter, and I remember how warm the house was. I have not thought of it in 20 years. I came here and I forgot." "You had a new country to learn," Nora said. "That is generous of you." He put his hat back on. "I told everyone you would not survive the winter. I said it more than once. I was wrong about that." "You couldn't have known from the outside," Nora said. "I should have remembered," he said. He left. She learned later that he did not tell his neighbors what he had seen inside her dugout. Pride is a currency people spend carefully and often refuse to part with, even when it costs them. But he stopped predicting her failure, and that was its own kind of statement. When she passed his homestead in the mornings, he raised a hand in greeting instead of looking at the horizon. Christmas came without ceremony. She cooked a small chicken that Emma Sandvik had sent over with Ruth, roasting it slow on the flat top of the stove, with dried sage from the herb bundle on the shelf. She read from her mother's Bible, not the Psalms, which she had never found particularly useful, but the marginal notes Ingrid had made in the decades she had owned it in Swedish, in the small, careful handwriting observations about planting dates and weather patterns and the behavior of animals before storms, about which neighbors could be trusted and which ones meant well but couldn't be relied upon, about the way soil quality changed across the bottomlands and what it meant for what could be grown where. Her mother's whole life of accumulated observation recorded in the margins of a religious text, because it was the one book she had always carried. After the chicken, she spent an hour working through more of Renaud's French notes with the dictionary Corwin had lent her. She had been working through them slowly over the previous weeks, and she was finding that Renaud had been not merely competent, but genuinely sophisticated in his thinking. His notes were not the sentimental journal of a man romanticizing his solitude. They were data as precise and systematic as anything Corwin might produce. Temperatures recorded at the same times every day across 14 winters organized by month and correlated with weather conditions. Wood consumption records. Detailed observations about which storm configurations caused the most heat loss through the roof sod and why. He had been doing science before he had a name for what he was doing, the same way she had been doing engineering. She felt reading his notes on Christmas evening with the lamp low and the stove ticking quietly. The same thing she had felt reading her mother's letter in the grain house, not alone but connected backward through time to people who had been cold and practical and alive and had thought carefully about how to remain so. Her grandfather in Dalarna, Renault on this hillside, the native traders who had described earth lodges as if explaining something as obvious as breathing. Her mother, who had saved 3 years of egg money and transcribed her own father's knowledge and placed it in a Bible because she loved her daughter and intended for her daughter to survive. None of them had known each other. All of them had arrived at the same answer. The 26th of December brought Fletcher Amos. Fletcher ran supply between Yankton and the scattered homesteads along the river road, and he had the particular credibility of a man who has been reading weather and terrain for 20 years, and whose livelihood depends on reading them correctly. He had stopped at her dugout once before in early December to sell her cornmeal, and had looked at her construction with the skeptical interest of a man who has watched too many frontier experiments fail to be easily impressed. He had been polite about his doubts. He was not a man who enjoyed being unkind. Now he came back with a different face. He had seen the sky to the northwest for 3 days. He had felt the pressure change in the way that long experience encodes itself in the body, in his ears, in his joints, in some combination of sensory information that his conscious mind had learned to read as warning. He had spoken with 2 other traders coming in from the Northern Territories who had said the same thing. "There is a blizzard coming," he said, standing at the entrance to her dugout with his hat in his hand. "Not an ordinary winter storm. The worst in at least a decade, maybe longer. It will arrive on the 29th. Temperature will go to 40 below, possibly further. The wind will be severe enough to disorient people outdoors. People will die in this storm." He looked at her with the directness of a man delivering information he believes is going to be acted upon. "You need to go to the Sandvik place or the Zimmerman farm before the 28th. You need to be with people in a solid structure. This is not something to ride out alone in a hillside no matter what you've built here." Nora went inside and took stock while he waited. 37 pounds of cornmeal, 43 pounds of salt pork, 28 pounds of dried beans, 12 pounds of rice, 6 pounds of coffee, 3 gallons of kerosene, 58 pounds of winter squash from the small separate cellar she had dug into the hillside 6 feet from the main entrance, 4 chickens still laying housed in their pen in the corner by the stove, 18 gallons of water in barrels, 3/4 of a quart of wood stacked in the entrance tunnel. She came back out. "I have enough supplies for 3 weeks," she said. "If I cannot survive this storm here, I could not survive it at the Sandvik place either. I stay." Fletcher Amos looked at the thin line of smoke rising from the hillside above them. He looked at her face. He was the kind of man who knows when an argument is lost and chooses not to waste time on it. "Your choice," he said. "I gave you the warning." "You did," Nora said. "Thank you." He left. She went back inside and began preparing. She checked the chimney outlet through the hatch she had built into the entrance tunnel for this purpose and found it clear. She checked the ventilation gap. She filled every available container with water, the barrels 2 cooking pots, a collection of smaller vessels, because extreme cold could affect even stored water in ways she did not yet have experience with. She moved the chickens from their corner pen to a position closer to the stove. She restacked the wood so the densest, driest pieces were most accessible. Then she sat down with Renault's notes and read his accounts of his worst winters. He had survived a storm in January of 1853 that had lasted 4 days and dropped the temperature by his outdoor thermometer to 44 below zero. His dugout, he recorded, maintained an interior temperature of 54 degrees throughout, burning 9 pounds of wood per day rather than his usual 5. He wrote with characteristic brevity, comfortable. She slept well that night. The blizzard arrived at 2 in the morning on the 29th of December, and it arrived the way extreme weather arrives, not gradually, but all at once, as if a door in the atmosphere had been opened and something vast and violent had come through it. One moment the night was cold and still. The next moment the world above the dugout was a roar that was not like wind, that was like the sound of something much larger than wind making itself known. The dugout shuddered. Not the walls, the sod walls 3 feet thick and 2 layers deep, did not move, but the roof timbers transmitted the vibration of the impact above a deep physical frequency she felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. Dust filtered down from between the roof sods in thin ghostly curtains. The door pressed hard against its frame and held. The thermometer inside read 54 degrees. She had expected some drop from the thermal disruption of the storm and had planned for it. The wind above was finding microscopic paths through the roof sod, not gaps exactly, but molecular pathways through material that was not perfectly sealed, extracting heat at a rate higher than the stored thermal mass alone could replace. She noted this for later: an additional layer of sod on the roof in spring, and perhaps canvas beneath it, as Renault had eventually added birch bark to his. She lit the stove and fed it 6 pounds of wood over the next 2 hours. The interior temperature climbed back to 62 degrees. Outside the entrance tunnel, the thermometer she had hung protected from direct wind read -31. It was still dropping. She cooked a pot of dried beans and salt pork on the stove. She read. She checked the chimney outlet at 10 o'clock and found it clear. She slept in shifts, 2 hours of sleep, then up to check the temperature and feed the stove if needed, then 2 more hours, and through the first night, the interior temperature never dropped below 56 degrees. Outside, the temperature reached -41. The second day of the blizzard was quieter than the first, which was deceptive. The howling assault of the first night had settled into a sustained, constant roar, not louder but more relentless, a steady extraction of heat from every surface it found. Nora increased her wood consumption to 8 pounds through the day and adjusted her remaining supply calculation accordingly. She still had more than enough. She was reading in the early evening of the second day, the 30th of December, when she heard it. 3 knocks on the outer door of the entrance tunnel. Slow, deliberate, the kind of knocking that costs something to produce. She sat very still for a moment, listening. In the world of the blizzard, she had existed completely alone on this hillside, the only person for what felt like miles in any direction. And the sound of knocking was so improbable that her first response was to wonder if she had imagined it. It came again. 3 knocks. Slower this time. She moved to the inner door and then through the entrance tunnel to the outer door and opened it. Birger Halvorsen stood at the end of the tunnel. He was holding his daughter against his chest. Sigrid, 7 years old, whose face had gone the color of chalk and whose eyes were closed. Ice had formed in Birger's beard and eyebrows. His expression was what you see on the face of a man who has spent everything he had getting to where he is and has nothing remaining. Not for words, not for pride, not for anything except the one thing he came here to do. Behind him, barely visible in the tunnel entrance, was his wife, Marta, bent forward with one hand against the tunnel wall, breathing in the careful way of a woman managing something difficult. Nora stepped back. "Come in," she said. Birger moved into the dugout and stood in the warmth and stopped. Simply stopped, the way a person stops when the thing they were bracing against ceases to be necessary. He set Sigrid down on the bed gently, and the child stirred and made a small sound, and the sound released something in Nora's chest that had been held tight since she opened the outer door. Marta came in and sat on the floor near the stove and put both hands toward the heat and closed her eyes. "What happened?" Nora said. "The north corner of the roof gave," Birger said. His voice was stripped of everything except the information. "Wind got in. The temperature in that room went below what the child could survive." He stopped. "Marta is near her time. She cannot be in the cold." Nora looked at Marta, who was sitting with the stillness of a woman who has been frightened and is now slowly believing that the fear might be over. The posture of late pregnancy was visible now that Nora was looking for it. "How near?" Nora said. Birger looked at his hands. 3 weeks, he said. She says perhaps sooner. Nora moved the pot of water she had been keeping warm and added more wood. She gave Sigrid her blanket. She gave Marta a cup of hot sage water, which was what she had, and it was warm and it was something. She did not say anything about what Birger had said about her dugout when he had first seen it. There was no need, and it would have been small. Birger sat against the wall and looked at the floor. "I told everyone you wouldn't make it," he said. "You came here," Nora said. "In that storm, carrying your daughter, you found your way to this hillside. You knew where to come." He looked up at her. "You knew it was the safest place," she said. "That means you understood it even when you said you didn't." Birger was quiet for a long time. "Then, when the corner gave, I thought of my father's hillside house in Norway. I thought of how warm it was when I was a boy. I knew where to bring them." The storm ran 3 days. Birger and Marta and Sigrid stayed. Sigrid's color came back over the first morning as she warmed. The temperature inside the dugout, with 4 people breathing and the stove running slightly harder than usual, climbed to 66 degrees by New Year's Eve. The additional body heat was its own form of thermal contribution, a fact Nora noted in the margin of her thinking for later. On the morning of New Year's Day, 1877, the wind stopped. Not gradually. It stopped between one moment and the next, the way a held breath stops, and the silence that followed was so profound and so complete that all 4 of them sat without moving for a full minute, adjusting to it as if it were a new country they had arrived in. Nora opened the outer door. The drifts were 8 and 9 feet in places, the landscape completely reshaped by the storm into forms it had not held before. The temperature was 42 degrees below zero, which was the coldest she had ever felt. Not cold that hurt exactly, but cold that simply ended things, that stopped motion and sound and possibility with the thoroughness of a door closing. She stood at the entrance for 30 seconds and then went back inside. Behind her, 56 degrees. She loaded her canvas bag with cornmeal and salt pork and the jar of preserved peaches Emma Sandvik had brought in December, and she went out into the aftermath. Aldrich Brower's youngest daughter, Hilda, 6 years old, had frostbite on 3 toes of her right foot. The stone house had held structurally. Aldrich's construction was genuinely good, but the interior temperature had dropped below 30 degrees on the second night, and Hilda had been sleeping nearest to the exterior wall. She would likely lose the toes. Aldrich stood in his kitchen looking at his daughter's wrapped foot and said nothing for a long time. Nora left the cornmeal and left. At the Crow household, the physical structure had held drafty and cold but standing. Reverend Crow's wife, Margaret, had gone into convulsions from the cold on the first night of the storm and had been wrapped in every piece of fabric the household possessed and prayed over through the night, and had survived pale and exhausted and alive. Reverend Crow met Nora at the door and took the food she offered, and did not say anything in his usual declarative manner. 4 people died in the wider settlement, Fletcher Amos told her afterward. 2 elderly men whose wood supply ran out on the second day. A young couple who went out to check their livestock on the first evening and became disoriented in the whiteout and were found 70 yards from their own door when the storm cleared. An infant 9 months old whose family's claim shack could not hold heat and whose small body could not generate enough warmth without help from the structure around it. Nora walked back to her dugout in the January cold and thought about that infant for a long time. 62 degrees inside. 62 degrees while the world went to 42 below, and people died in their houses, in their well-built timber frame houses, and their mortared stone houses, and their claim shacks because their houses did not work. Not because the people were careless or weak or unlucky, because the answer they had all brought with them from wherever they came from, the exposed timber frame, the stone house, the wooden box sitting open to the sky, was the wrong answer to the specific problem of a Dakota winter, and the wrong answer was killing people. Had been killing people for the years since the territory opened, would continue killing people until someone changed it. Corwin Hale arrived the day after the storm cleared on foot in the January cold with his notebook. He spent 3 hours inside the dugout, measuring everything: wall thickness and air gap dimensions, roof angle and sod depth floor, grade chimney placement, stove position, ventilation gap size, and orientation. He recorded the interior temperature and Nora's outdoor thermometer reading and calculated the differential. He asked her about her wood consumption across the 3 days of the blizzard and wrote down every number she gave him with the attention of a man who understands he is looking at evidence. "What you have built here," he said, when he had closed his notebook and sat across the table from her, "is a solution to the fundamental problem of prairie settlement. Not a partial solution, not an improvement, a solution. A family could build this for a third of the cost of a timber frame house. It would use a fifth of the fuel across a winter. Children would not die of exposure in structures built this way." "I was lucky with the location," Nora said. Renault's map. "You chose the location," Corwin said. "You chose it before you found the map. You chose it for the same reasons Renault chose it, which means you understood the same principles he understood, which means the map confirmed what you already knew. That is not luck. That is the same knowledge arriving through a different route." He looked at her steadily. "I am going to write to the Dakota Free Press," he said. "This needs to be known. It needs to be documented and distributed before another winter kills people who could have been saved." Nora looked at Renault's map on the shelf, at her mother's Bible beside it, at the evidence of all the knowledge that had converged in this hillside from 3 traditions and 2 generations and one long chain of people who had paid attention to what the earth was actually doing rather than what they had been told it was doing. "Write it," she said. Corwin Hale's article ran in the Dakota Free Press on the 18th of January, 1877, on the second page beneath a railroad dispute and above a patent medicine advertisement. The title was dry and precise: "A thermally efficient dwelling for prairie settlement, comparative temperature and fuel consumption. Data winter 1876 to 77. It was not a title designed to attract casual readers. It was a title designed to attract people who needed the information badly enough to read carefully. Corwin had written it with the measured precision of a man who knows that precision is the only argument that survives sustained skepticism. Temperatures and dates and fuel measurements and structural specifications, all presented without sentimentality, all documented with the rigor of someone who had been present and had measured what he described. He had referred to the builder of the structure as N. Voss Homesteader, age 16. By February, the article had been reprinted in 3 other territorial papers. By March, people were finding their way to her hillside. The Hawthorne family came first. Randall, his wife Cecily, their 3 children under 10, having spent the winter in a claim shack that had nearly killed them twice, and who were prepared visibly and completely to try something different. They stood at the entrance to her dugout on a Thursday morning in early March with the careful politeness of people who have learned that help is not always available and do not want to presume. $5, Nora said. "I walk your land with you, help you choose the site, and give you the full specifications. The labor is yours." Randall Hawthorne looked at his wife. Something moved between them that required no words. "Done," he said. She spent that afternoon on the Hawthorne claim, walking the terrain with the same patient attention her mother had used to read landscapes, not for what was announced on the surface, but for what was offered underneath. The claim had 2 viable hillsides. One faced southeast, one faced south. She chose the south-facing one and explained why, pointing out the winter sun angle and tracing with her hand the seasonal wind patterns she had learned from Renault's notes and from 2 full seasons of her own observation. She walked Randall to where the slope angle was best and showed him how to identify the clay layer and why the clay mattered for moisture management. She had written the specifications out on paper the week before anticipating this conversation, and she handed Randall the 4-page document and watched him read it. "This is everything," he said. "That is everything," Nora said. "The rest is work." The Hawthorns built their dugout in 22 days. It came out nearly right on the first attempt, which was a testament to how clearly the specifications could be followed when someone was genuinely motivated to follow them. The one error, a slight miscalculation in the chimney angle, Nora caught on a site visit and corrected before the clay lining was set. 4 more families by April. By May, she had 9 consultations complete and 4 scheduled. She raised her fee to $7 in April, having noticed that the lower figure made certain men uncomfortable in a way that undermined their confidence in the advice, as if the price were evidence of its worth. $7 was still considerably less than the cost of a single cord of firewood in a hard winter, and no one argued with it. Corwin came regularly through the spring, not as an advisor, but as a documenter. He was building a comprehensive record construction methods, materials costs, temperature, outcomes across different structures, seasonal performance. He had written 2 more letters to territorial papers and had begun corresponding with a professor of engineering at a university in the East, whose name Nora did not recognize and whose interest she found abstractly satisfying. As confirmation from a direction she had not needed confirmation from but was glad to receive. She liked Corwin. She was careful about the liking, aware as she was of the difference between valuing someone's company and needing it, and she was not going to confuse the two. But he was honest in a way that was genuinely rarer than it should have been, and curious in a way that was rarer still, and he had the qualities she had come to value most in anyone. He meant what he said, and said what he meant, and did not use words to perform feelings he did not have. Since January, he had stopped offering caveats and started offering observations. The distinction mattered considerably. Spring thaw came in April with the mud she had not fully anticipated. The hillside above the dugout shed its snowpack over 2 warm weeks, and the meltwater found paths through the roof, sod she had not identified during the blizzard, because frozen water does not move and does not reveal its routes. She woke on a Tuesday morning to a thin trickle running down the back wall, finding the drainage grate she had built and making its way toward the entrance without pooling. Annoying but not dangerous. Fixable. She spent 3 days in April on the roof, augmenting the sod layer over the problem areas, adding canvas beneath the top sod, where Renault's notes had eventually recommended birch bark, pressing the new bricks into place with the same overlapping pattern as the original work. Corwin helped standing above her on the hillside and passing sod bricks down as she positioned them. They worked without much talking, which was comfortable in the way that working alongside someone who does not need silence filled is comfortable. At one point, he said from above, Renault must have had this same problem every spring. What did he do about it eventually, Nora asked. Corwin consulted the notes. Birch bark beneath the top sod layer. Acts as a moisture barrier. He got it from the native traders. I don't have birch bark, Nora said. Canvas does the same thing, Corwin said. You have canvas. She did. She added it. The roof did not leak again that spring or in the 2 springs following. Then on a Wednesday morning in late March, she saw him coming. She was on the hillside above the dugout, checking the soil condition for spring planting, when she looked north and saw 2 riders on the road. One she recognized from his posture and his horse Clem Stanton riding with the particular set of his shoulders that she associated with him when he was marshaling some form of authority he was not quite sure he possessed. The other was a man she did not recognize, wearing a town coat and carrying a leather satchel held close against his body. The leather satchel told her what she needed to know. She came down from the hillside and stood in front of her dugout and waited. Clem looked different from the last time she had seen him. The ease he had always carried, the ease of a man who believes the ground beneath him is naturally his. By some arrangement he has never needed to examine, was absent now. He was holding himself tighter. The man beside him had a practiced neutral expression and the manner of someone who has decided in advance that pleasantries are an inefficient use of time. Nora, Clem said. She said nothing. He cleared his throat. This is Mr. Aldous Fitch, he said. He has a legal matter to discuss. Aldous Fitch opened his satchel and produced a document and held it out to her. Miss Voss, he said, you filed a homestead claim in November of last year. At that time, you were 16 years of age. The Homestead Act requires claimants to be 21 years of age or to be the head of a household. You were neither. The claim is therefore potentially invalid. We are here to give formal notice of our intention to contest it with the District Land Office. You have 30 days to respond before we file. Nora took the document. She read it once quickly and then again slowly the way her mother had taught her to read important documents because the second reading always finds what the first reading misses. She looked at Clem. He was not quite meeting her eyes. She looked at Fitch. I'll need time to consult, she said. Of course, Fitch said. 30 days. They left. She watched them go and then stood in front of her dugout for a while with the document in her hand and looked at the Missouri River bottomlands spreading out below her in the March light. She had built something real here. She had survived a winter that killed 4 people and kept 6 alive in this hillside. She had done it with $27 of materials and her grandfather's instructions and a dead trapper's map. She had proven something that needed proving, and people were coming to learn from her, and she had money and savings from consultations and wood left over, and 4 chickens still laying. And Clem Stanton had come with a lawyer to take it. She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket and walked 4 miles to the schoolhouse. She waited on the steps until afternoon classes ended and the last student had gone home, and then she handed Corwin the document without explanation and watched him read it. He read it twice. The slight tightening around his eyes told her he was taking it seriously. Sit down, he said. She sat on the steps. The Homestead Act of 1862 specifies 21 as the standard age, he said. But there are provisions that are not commonly invoked because the circumstances requiring them are not common. He turned the document over and began writing on the back. One of those provisions applies to you. He wrote as he spoke. The Act contains an exception for legal orphans persons for whom both parents are deceased. The framers of the Act were specifically concerned about leaving young people without land access simply because of age when they had no family to shelter them. Your father died when you were 8. Your mother died in March of last year. You are legally a complete orphan. The age requirement does not apply to you. He looked up at her. But the orphan provision is only the primary argument, he said. There's a secondary one. You filed under N. Voss and stated your age as 18. The clerk accepted the filing and issued the claim certificate. A filing accepted in good faith by a federal land office officer has substantial standing independent of the claimant's actual age. They would need to overcome both arguments. Do you have documentation of your parents' deaths, he asked. My mother is in the Yankton Lutheran Church Register, Nora said. My father is in county records in Minnesota. Get me the church register entry, Corwin said. I'll write to Minnesota for your father's record. We'll file a response before the 30 days run out. Nora folded the document and stood up. She thought about what this would cost him, the time, the correspondence, the navigation of a legal process he was not trained for on behalf of a 16-year-old girl who could not pay him for it. Thank you, she said. He looked at her steadily. I'm documenting the construction methods here for scientific purposes, he said. It would be inconvenient to have the primary case study evicted. She almost smiled. He almost did too. The church register entry came from Reverend Crow. In 2 days, he had located it himself and provided a written attestation without being asked, which was its own form of statement about how he had changed since the blizzard. The Minnesota records arrived 3 weeks later by post, and Corwin filed the response to the contest with the district land office on the 26th day of the 30 allowed. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in April in a room at the district land office in Yankton that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular atmosphere of official decisions made in small spaces. Nora sat on one side of the table. Clem Stanton and Aldous Fitch sat on the other. The land officer, Jeremiah Cross, who had been processing homestead claims for 11 years and had the focused patience of someone who has seen most of what a given process can produce in terms of human complication, sat at the head with the documents arranged before him. Corwin sat beside Nora. He was not a lawyer, a fact Fitch noted on sitting down with the smooth satisfaction of a man scoring an early point. Corwin acknowledged it without apparent concern. Cross read through everything: the orphan provision, the documentation, Corwin's written argument, the church register entry, the Minnesota county record. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which Corwin answered with citations. He read the church register entry again. Then he set everything down. "The orphan provision is not ambiguous," he said to Fitch. "The claimant qualifies. The contest is not valid on those grounds." Fitch opened his mouth. Cross held up one hand. "I'm not finished. In reviewing this matter, I ran a routine check on the contesting party's standing, which is standard procedure." He picked up a page from the stack before him. "Mr. Stanton, the homestead claim you currently occupy, Section 14, filed 1872, was used as collateral for a loan from the First Bank of Yankton in October of last year. The loan is in default. The bank has filed for recovery of the collateral property. This office has the bank's notification on record." He set the page down. "You do not currently have clear title to the property from which you are contesting," he said, "which means you do not have legal standing to bring this contest." The room held a particular silence. Nora looked at Clem Stanton. He was looking at the table. He had the face of a man watching something slide out of his grip and finding nothing underneath it. The homestead that Ingrid Voss had worked through Dakota winters with cold hands and absolute patience, the land Clem had taken as his own, by virtue of a marriage to a woman who deserved considerably better. He had used it as collateral in a loan that had gone wrong, and the bank had filed and it was already gone. He had come here to take Nora's land because he had already lost his own. He had sent a 16-year-old girl into a Dakota winter at 19 below zero and spent the winter that followed losing everything her mother had built. Fitch was gathering his papers with the efficiency of a man moving to the next item on his schedule. Clem had not moved. Nora stood. She gathered her documents. She looked at Clem one more time, not with anger, she found, because anger requires a certain ongoing investment in the person who caused the harm, and she had stopped investing in Clem Stanton. Not with satisfaction either, exactly. With something closer to clarity. She could see him completely now, not a villain in the structural sense that stories require, not someone who had planned elaborate harm with deliberate intent. A small man who had made small choices that accumulated into a large harm, and the harm had returned to him the way harm tends to return, not through the intervention of justice, but through the simple arithmetic of consequence. She walked out into the April morning. Corwin came out behind her, and they stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment without speaking. She was thinking about her mother, about Ingrid Voss, who had spent years building something alongside a man who was not worthy of it, and had known it and had made the best possible preparation she could for what she could see coming, who had not been able to choose her circumstances but had chosen precisely and carefully what she did with them. Nora intended to do the same. She had already started. She spent the summer of 1877 in continuous work. The consultations ran through June and into August. 17 families by the end of summer spread across 3 counties. Each consultation generating a modified specification document that incorporated what she had learned from the previous one. The document was 4 pages long by June and 5 pages by August. It represented the combined knowledge of her grandfather's Dalarna methods, Renault's 14 winters of recorded observation, the native Earth Lodge principles from the traders' conversations, and her own 2 years of continuous data collection. No single tradition had all the answers. Combined, they had most of them. Birger Halvorsen built a new structure that summer, not a full dugout, but a hybrid of his own design. A timber frame house set 2 feet into the ground, with earth bermed against 3 of its 4 exterior walls, and a sod roof rather than shingles. He cut his wood consumption by more than half. He appeared at Nora's door one Tuesday evening in July, with a piece of cured venison wrapped in cloth, set it on her table without comment, and left. She understood completely. Aldrich Brower came on the Saturday in June. He stood outside her entrance with his hat in both hands and said without preamble, "I was wrong about what I told you. I was applying what I know about stone construction, and it did not apply here. You solved the moisture problem in a way I told you was impossible. I should have listened when I still had time to learn before my daughter lost her toes." She invited him in for coffee. He accepted. They sat at her table and talked about construction for an hour, and when he left, he shook her hand the way German craftsmen shake hands formally between equals. The formality was its own kind of apology and its own kind of respect. One morning in early spring of 1878, Reverend Silas Crow's wagon went past her hillside heading east fully loaded. He stopped at her entrance. He held his hat in both hands. "Miss Voss," he said, "I owe you a direct statement. I told you that you were behaving improperly. I told you that nature would not permit what you were attempting. I told you that you would be gone before spring and that this land would go to someone more suited to it." He looked at her dugout, which was going into its second winter in better condition than when it had gone into its first. "My wife is alive because you opened your door to the Halverson family on the second night of the blizzard, and because of what you built that made opening that door possible. I don't know how far the chain extends. I suspect neither do you. I came west believing I understood what civilization meant and what this territory needed. I was wrong about that. I'm less wrong now. Less wrong." He drove away. She watched him go and thought that arriving at a less wrong understanding even late was more than some people managed. It was in the spring of 1878 when she and Carl Zimmerman were digging out the back wall of the original dugout to add a third room that Carl's shovel struck something that gave differently from the surrounding earth. Not the resistance of a stone or root, the specific quality of something hollow that has been protected rather than simply buried. They cleared the earth from around it with their hands. It was wrapped in canvas, coated in beeswax, the same technique her mother had used to protect the letter inside the Bible's back cover, the technique of someone who understands that what is worth keeping is worth protecting from moisture. Inside the canvas, folded flat, a single sheet of paper covered in Renaud's small, deliberate French. She carried it to Corwin that evening. He read it aloud, translating slowly while she sat across the table and listened. Renaud had written it in January of 1856, when he was ill and knew it. The letter was not sentimental. He had not been a sentimental man, as his notes made clear, but it was precise in the way all his records were precise, and the precision gave it a gravity that sentiment would have undermined. He had no children and no heirs, and was not sorry for it, he wrote. He had lived 14 winters in the earth of this hillside, and been warm in all of them, and had not been cold or frightened or hungry, in the way that the people who built their houses above the ground were cold and frightened and hungry. He had buried the first box, the map, and the notes at the edge of the hillside because he believed that whoever came to dig there eventually would be the kind of person who dug in the right places, and he had wanted the information to outlast him rather than disappear with him. The second letter he wrote was for whoever had used the first one well enough to dig all the way to the back wall, which meant whoever found this had built here, had survived here, had added their own rooms to the earth, which meant they had understood. "I have been warm in 14 winters." Corwin translated, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "I have never taught this to anyone, and that is my only regret. Whoever finds this learned it alone, which means you were the kind of person who could have learned it without me. But I hope the first box helped. I hope the hill was good to you. I hope you were warm." Nora sat with the letter for a long time after Corwin set it down. Her grandfather in Dalarna building into hillsides in Sweden because the winters were long and the earth was free and the knowledge was old. Theodore Renaud on this hillside recording temperatures across 14 winters and bearing his knowledge so it would outlast him. The native traders who had described earth lodges with the matter-of-fact clarity of people explaining something obvious, something their grandparents had built and their grandparents' grandparents before them. Her mother, who had written 7 sentences in the back of a Bible because she loved her daughter and had planned for her daughter's survival with the same practical care she had applied to every other problem the world had set before her. None of them had known each other. None had planned for this specific moment, this specific girl, this specific hillside in Dakota Territory in 1878. They had each simply passed forward what they knew, because passing forward what you know is the only mechanism by which anything survives beyond the person who learned it. She was not the inventor of any of it. She was the convergence point, the place where 3 traditions in 2 generations in one long chain of people who had paid attention to what the earth was actually doing had arrived simultaneously. She looked up at Corwin. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know as his thinking face, not blank but inward, the look of a man assembling things. She said, "Will you help me write all of it down properly? Not just the measurements, The whole system, the principles behind the measurements, the reasoning, the data from Renault's records, and my own, the site selection criteria, the moisture management across all 4 seasons, everything. A document that anyone could follow. He looked at her for a moment. A manual, he said. For anyone who needs it, she said, so that the knowledge doesn't disappear when we do. He picked up his pen. We'll need considerably more paper, he said. They spent the winter of 1878 writing it. The document that emerged across that winter was 31 pages organized with the logical rigor Corwin brought to it and the practical specificity Nora brought from 2 years of continuous data and 43 consultations. Every aspect of earth-sheltered construction they had collectively learned and documented was their site selection criteria and how to read terrain for thermal advantage. Excavation specifications for different soil types, wall construction and the central importance of the air gap roof design, and timber sizing calculations for different spans, floor drainage, engineering, chimney design, and clay lining specifications, ventilation principles for all 4 seasons, moisture management from initial construction through the first spring thaw and beyond. Nora wrote the practical sections from memory and from the field notes she had kept. Corwin wrote the theoretical framework and the data analysis from his records. Where Renault's observations aligned precisely with the physics, they said so and cited both. Where the native Earth Lodge principles solved problems that the European-derived techniques had not addressed, they said that too and credited it accordingly. The document did not pretend that any of this originated with them. The document was honest about what it was, the recorded form of knowledge that had existed in several traditions and had never before been written down in one place. It went to the Dakota Free Press in the spring, serialized across 4 issues. It was reprinted in Nebraska and Montana. The professor of engineering in the East wrote a letter of appreciation so detailed and specific that Corwin read it twice and considered it sufficient, and Nora read it once and agreed. Corwin Hale asked her to marry him in May of 1880. He did it with the directness she had come to expect from him, directly, without preamble, standing at the entrance to the dugout on a warm spring evening with the sunset behind him, painting the Dakota sky in colors that did not seem possible until they appeared. I think we work well together, he said. I think we are well matched in the ways that matter. I am not skilled at the kind of language people usually use for this, and I don't think you want it. I'm asking you to marry me. She looked at him. She was 20 years old. Yes, she said, on the condition that we design the new structure together. I assumed we would, he said. They were married in June in the Lutheran church in Yankton by a minister who had arrived from Minnesota the previous year and had no preconceived opinions about young women who built into hillsides. The wedding was attended by the Halverson family, Berger and Marta and Sigrid, and a new baby boy named Anders, born safely in the earth of Nora's dugout in February of '77, delivered by Marta herself in warmth, while the Dakota winter raged outside, in the Brower family, and Carl and Otto Zimmerman with their parents, in the Hawthorne family, and 7 other families whose structures Nora had helped design. And Corwin's widowed mother, who had traveled from Wisconsin and who took Nora's hand after the ceremony and held it for a moment and said quietly, he needed someone smarter than himself. I'm glad he was wise enough to know it. They built a new structure on the same claim that summer, 24 feet wide, 36 feet deep, 3 rooms with a proper second room for the work of documentation and correspondence, that now occupied a substantial portion of their time skylights, that Corwin had engineered from principles he had found in mining engineering journals, and that brought natural light into rooms that had no south-facing walls. A ventilation system that drew fresh air from one side of the hillside and exhausted spent air from the other using the pressure differential the hillside itself created. It was everything the first dugout had been and more. The original dugout became a storage room and workspace. Nora did not tear it down. It was $27 in 19 days, and her grandfather's knowledge and Renault's map and her mother's faith in her. It was the first thing she had built. She was not going to tear it down. She worked through the 1880s and into the 90s consulting on earth-sheltered structures across 3 states as the territory filled with settlers and the demand for practical survival knowledge grew with the population. She trained Carl Zimmerman, who had grown into a careful and talented builder with a natural feel for terrain and soil, to conduct consultations himself, which doubled the reach of what she could teach in a given season. She trained two other builders in Nebraska by the late 80s. She corresponded with engineers and architects and farmers and homesteaders across the northern plains, answering questions by letter with the patience of someone who understands that knowledge only exists in practice when it is shared. She wrote to a city planner in Omaha who wanted to understand why the most durable structures on the northern prairie were so often partially underground. She wrote to the professor of engineering in the East, who had become a genuine correspondent rather than a distant admirer. The reasons were always the same reasons she told them all. The earth is a better insulator than timber. It does not burn, it does not rot. It does not change dimension with temperature in ways that open cracks for wind and cold. It is available everywhere at no cost beyond labor. The people who had built into the earth for centuries in Dalarna and in France and in the territories of the people displaced to make room for the settlers had understood something that the European timber building tradition had decided to overlook, because timber was familiar and earth was primitive seeming, and the difference between familiar and correct is a distinction that costs people everything when winter is the examiner. It was not primitive. It had never been primitive. The sophistication was in the understanding that you do not fight nature. You learn its shape and you build along that shape, and nature does the work. The earth holds heat because that is what enormous thermal mass does. Still air insulates because that is what still air does. South-facing slopes receive more solar energy in winter because that is what the geometry of the Earth's tilt produces. None of these were inventions. They were observations about how the world actually works, made by people across multiple centuries and multiple continents, and the only thing Nora had done was listen to all of them at the same time. She said this in different formulations to different people for the rest of her life. Corwin died in 1921. He had lived 61 years and spent 40 of them documenting forgotten knowledge with the focused care of a man who understood that what is not recorded eventually disappears. His papers went to the university in the East, where they remain studied now mostly by engineers and architectural historians rather than by homesteaders, though the knowledge in them is as applicable as it ever was. Nora Voss died on a November morning in 1927. She was 67 years old. She had lived on that Dakota hillside for 51 years in 3 successive structures, all built on the same principles as the first, all standing at the end of her life. Her 4 children had grown up in those structures, healthy in ways that the children of the neighboring timber frame homesteads were often not, and her eldest daughter, a woman named Ingrid, for her grandmother, which was the kind of continuity that does not require explanation, was living in the expanded main structure when Nora died. The Yankton newspaper's obituary called her an architect and an engineer, though she had never studied either formally. The Dakota Free Press, which had published Corwin's first article about the dugout half a century before, ran a longer piece. It described the 43 structures she had personally consulted on across 3 states and the additional work of Carl Zimmerman and the other builders she had trained. And it offered a conservative estimate of 61 lives saved through the direct application of her methods. People who would have died of exposure or fuel shortage in conventional structures but had survived because the house around them was built with the earth instead of against it. The original dugout, the one built for $27 and 19 days of labor in November of 1876 by a 16-year-old girl with no construction experience and $287 in a dead mother's instructions, was still standing. It had been augmented twice. The roof improved in the spring of 1878 after the first thaw revealed its weaknesses. A skylight added in 1884 when the documentation work required better daytime light than the original windows provided. Its fundamental structure was unchanged. The sod walls Nora and the Zimmerman brothers had cut from Dakota bluestem in November of '76 were still intact, the root systems still woven tight through the soil, the air gap still doing what still air has always done. On the morning after Nora's death, Ingrid went into the original dugout to retrieve something she had stored there. She went in the early morning before the household was fully awake, in the quiet that comes before the day organizes itself. It was November. The air outside was still and cold, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east over the Missouri River bottomlands. Inside the dugout, no fire had been lit since September. The thermometer on the shelf beside her grandmother's Bible read 53 degrees. Outside the thermometer her mother had hung by the entrance 51 years ago, the same instrument she had hung there in her first December to measure the cold that everyone said would kill her, read 8 degrees below zero. 61 degrees of difference. Earth and air separated by sod and timber and a 2-foot gap of still nothing. Ingrid stood in the doorway for a while. She was thinking about her mother at 16 walking south on the river road in 19 below cold, with a canvas bag and a tin box and no clear destination except away from what had been done to her and toward what she intended to build. She was thinking about her grandmother Ingrid, who had crossed an ocean alone at 22 and built a life in a difficult country and found in the months before she died the presence of mind and the love to prepare her daughter for a future she would not see. She was thinking about Theodore Renaud, who had lived and died alone on this hillside and buried his knowledge in tin boxes in the earth so that whoever came after would not have to start from nothing. She was thinking about a man in Dalarna, Sweden, whose name she did not know, who had built into a hillside in a cold country because the earth was free and the winters were long, and the principles are the same regardless of which country you are standing in. She was thinking about how knowledge travels, not through institutions, not through schools, not through the official mechanisms by which civilizations tell themselves their knowledge is being preserved. Through people, through the careful, deliberate act of one person passing to the next what they have learned at cost, what they have earned through cold and labor, and the particular kind of attention that produces understanding rather than just information. Through letters placed in the back covers of Bibles, through maps buried in oilskin and hillsides, through conversations with old trappers and native traders who know things that no one is writing down, through a 16-year-old girl who listened to all of it at the same time and built something that held. The earth held 53 degrees. It had held 52 or 53 degrees in that dugout through every winter since 1876. It would hold that temperature after Ingrid left. It would hold it next winter and the winter after, whether anyone lit a fire or not, whether anyone remembered whose hands had cut the sod, or whose calculations had set the floor grade, or whose mother had hidden the instructions in the back of a Bible. The earth does not need to be reminded of what it is. Some things are built to last, not because they are grand or expensive or loud about their own significance, but because they are built from observation, rather than assumption, from patience, rather than haste, from the willingness to listen to what is actually there, instead of shouting over it with what you brought with you from somewhere else. Nora Voss had listened. She had been 16 years old and alone in a Dakota winter with $287 and her grandfather's instructions and a dead trapper's map, and the absolute refusal to believe that the circumstances other people had arranged for her were the final word on what her life was allowed to be. She had dug into the earth, and the earth had kept her warm.